3 million watched live. But only one person, Jasmine Crockett, had the courage to say what no one else dared. The cameras were rolling, the jokes were flowing, and the studio, built for laughter, wasn't ready for what was about to unfold. Because in just a few quiet moments, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam the table. She didn't perform. She did something far more devastating. She told the truth. And that truth, spoken with clarity, not volume, cut through decades of deflection, denial, and disguise. As the host smiled nervously, as the audience shifted in their seats, she calmly asked a question no one was prepared to answer. In a world that applauds noise, why did her silence echo louder than every punchline in the room? What you're about to witness is a dramatized retelling of a real televised moment, blended with deeper truths, lived experiences, and emotional realities faced by millions every day. While names and events have been adapted for narrative clarity, the injustices are real, the silences are real, and the impact is real. Because sometimes the most powerful mic drop isn't a sound, it's a shift. The studio lights always felt too bright on the nights when something was about to go wrong. It wasn't just heat. It was that kind of glare that made you feel like the room saw more of you than it should. And tonight, in the real-time studio on the Burbank lot, the lights weren't just overexposed, they were watching. Somewhere backstage, a makeup artist was powdering the forehead of a man who didn't think this episode would be different. The cue cards were on the desk. The mugs were filled. The audience had been warmed up with 10 minutes of laughter, some light jokes about Washington chaos, and a few recycled zingers about Elon Musk. Everything was in place. Everything was ready for a show they thought would be just like last week. But it wouldn't be, because tonight, something unplanned was going to unfold, and it wouldn't come with yelling, it would come with stillness. Jasmine Crockett sat at the edge of the panel, not shifting, not smiling too much, just present. Her heels were planted, not crossed, and her pen tapped gently, rhythmically, against a folded cue card in her lap. To anyone else, she looked relaxed, but there was something in the way her eyes stayed fixed. Not on Bill, not on the cameras, but on the air itself, as if she were listening to a conversation that hadn't started yet. And maybe in her head she was, because Jasmine didn't show up tonight just to give her take. She wasn't here to play the panelist game, to perform civility in front of laughter. She was here because she'd been quiet long enough. To the crew, she was just another guest. A congresswoman, sure, but not a headline name. Not someone expected to spike the ratings. She wasn't flashy. She didn't sell scandal, but that was what made her dangerous. Jasmine Crockett didn't need a viral moment. She needed a clear one. Bill Maher, on the other hand, was already leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed controversy couldn't touch him. He had weathered decades of backlash, rode waves of applause and outrage like they were the same tide. Just last week, he had attended a Trump rally in Bakersfield and had laughed, clapped, called it a field trip, and watched the internet explode around him. The controversy hadn't rattled him. It never did. In his mind, being misunderstood was part of the brand. But tonight, that confidence, those crossed legs, that smug sip from the liberal freethinker mug, would face something it wasn't ready for. Not a scream. Not a protest. Just Jasmine. The audience, still giggling from the warm-up act, had no idea what was coming. They weren't here to learn. They were here to laugh. But what happens when a truth enters the room that doesn't ask for permission? What happens when someone refuses to play along and instead points quietly to the fire everyone else is pretending not to smell? The cameras whirred. The lights hummed. The opening music faded into applause. Bill adjusted his blazer and began with the usual smirk. Well, if you're watching this, congratulations. You survived another week in America. Laughter, applause. The panelists chuckled politely. Jasmine didn't. In precisely 17 seconds, something was going to shift in that room. But not yet, not quite. Because first the jokes had to land, the egos had to strut, the noise had to peak. Only then, when no one was expecting it, would Jasmine Crockett begin. And when she did, the silence that followed would be louder than every punchline before it. There's a kind of attention that doesn't have to be asked for. It just happens. It doesn't come from dramatic entrances or louder voices. It isn't won through clever one-liners or borrowed applause. It emerges from stillness, from certainty, from the quiet confidence of someone who knows they don't need to prove anything to anyone in the room. Jasmine Crockett sat with that kind of presence. She wasn't hunched forward like the panelist next to her, eager for airtime. She wasn't adjusting her earpiece or rehearsing talking points under her breath. She simply sat there, anchored, composed, complete. It wasn't that she wasn't nervous. It was that she had learned long ago that nerves don't serve you in rooms like this. Only clarity does. Bill Maher glanced her way between quips. He noticed her posture but misread it, like so many had before. To him, stillness meant passivity. She's calm, he probably thought, reserved, maybe even unsure. Good. He'd ask her something easy later. Let her play the serious one while the crowd laughed. He thought he was managing the room. He always did. But Jasmine wasn't waiting to be managed. She was waiting for her moment, and she could feel it approaching. The conversation drifted from the Trump rally to the state of comedy in a cancel culture world. The audience laughed on cue. The tech entrepreneur on the left kept jumping in with fast, half-finished sound bites. The best-selling author from Vermont quoted herself twice in the same sentence. And Bill, ever the conductor, kept the rhythm moving, smirking, sipping, steering the tone away from discomfort and back toward digestible conflict. He was a master of keeping the room just edgy enough to trend, but never uncomfortable enough to risk truth. That's how the system worked. That's why they kept inviting him back. But Jasmine wasn't a performer. She didn't offer amusement or outrage. She didn't fit into the narrative arcs they'd written before she arrived. And that's exactly what made her dangerous. She watched the banter like someone observing a rehearsal, aware it was a play, but not interested in joining the cast. Her hand rested on a folder in her lap, a single tab poking out from the side labeled in bold black ink. Dallas. That folder didn't hold punchlines. It held real people, real names, stories that didn't end in laughter. She could feel the audience start to scan her. It always happened around the 10-minute mark, that subtle collective glance, wondering who the quiet one was and when she'd speak. Some assumed she had nothing to say. Others knew better and started to lean in. Even the studio crew, trained to tune out dialogue after years on set, found themselves watching her a second too long because something about her didn't fit. Not in a bad way, in a way that made you question why everyone else did. Jasmine could sense it. That moment just before a storm shifts the air. Her father used to say, "Still water cuts the deepest." She never fully understood that as a child. She did now. When Bill finally turned to her, his voice light and teasing, she met his gaze without smiling. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "I'm guessing you've got thoughts about this whole comedy field trip thing." It was meant to disarm her, to pull her into the joke before she could speak plainly. A classic trick, one that often worked, but Jasmine didn't blink. She reached slowly for her mic, adjusted it gently, and said, "I do. But before we start calling this comedy, let's make sure we're clear on what actually happened." The smile on Bill's face faltered, not completely, just enough. The audience didn't laugh. Not yet. Jasmine had spoken fewer than 20 words, but already the tone had changed. She didn't come to perform. She came to remind the room that behind every punchline, there are people who never got to laugh. And they were watching too. The first few seconds after she spoke didn't feel like a reaction. They felt like a reset, as if the room, so used to cadence and rhythm and programmed responses, suddenly missed a beat. Jasmine's words hadn't landed with force. They hadn't needed to. They landed with clarity. And clarity in a space built for distraction is more jarring than any insult. Bill blinked once, then smiled again. But this time it was thinner. The kind of smile that hoped no one else had noticed the shift he just felt in his spine. "Well," he said, chuckling under his breath, "I think that's a little harsh, don't you?" His voice reached for levity, like a lifeboat, but Jasmine didn't throw him one. She didn't soften. She didn't clarify. She didn't flinch. She folded her hand and said, "Do you?" There was no sarcasm, no aggression, just a question, planted like a seed that would grow whether he answered it or not. The audience didn't laugh, not because they disagreed, but because they didn't know if they were supposed to. That was the problem with truth. It didn't come with cues. And tonight, Jasmine wasn't offering any. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She waited. And that patience made people nervous. Because waiting meant she wasn't reacting. She was watching. Bill leaned back slightly, trying to reassert control. "Look," he said, "I've always said the left, the right. It doesn't matter. Comedy is how we cope. We can't keep pretending that talking to the other side is betrayal." He glanced at the audience as if asking them to agree. A few gave polite nods. The panelist next to him mumbled exactly into her cup. It was almost enough to reset the tone. Almost. But Jasmine didn't let it drift. She leaned forward, not much, just enough to signal the conversation was no longer casual. "You weren't just talking, Bill," she said. "You were laughing. With people who cheer when a reporter gets told to go back to where you came from. That's not comedy. That's cruelty." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was undeniable. The kind that wraps itself around the room and won't let go. The kind that makes even the cameramen stop adjusting focus. For once, there was no rustle of paper, no cough from the back row, no keyboard tapping in the control booth. Just air, still, stretched thin by truth. Bill opened his mouth, then closed it. Not out of agreement, at least not yet, but because for the first time in a long time, he didn't have a comeback ready. That wasn't part of the script. Jasmine, meanwhile, hadn't broken stride. Her breathing was steady, her tone unchanged. There was power in her poise, not performative, but disciplined. She wasn't here to dominate. She was here to disrupt, not by shouting, but by refusing to pretend the game was harmless. And that was the real threat. Not what she said, but what she didn't do. She didn't take the bait. She didn't play along. She didn't diffuse the tension. She let it build, let it exist, let it do what it was meant to do. Expose the cracks behind the comedy. For years, Bill Maher had leaned on discomfort to sell the illusion of truth. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett used silence to deliver the real thing. He laughed again, but it didn't land this time. It was the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to pretend everything's fine, like a bad actor holding a cracked glass and insisting it's not leaking. "Okay," Bill said, tapping his mug. "So now I'm responsible for what strangers yell at a rally?" He chuckled, alone. No one joined him. The laughter in the room, once easy and automatic, had become cautious, controlled. Jasmine hadn't scolded him. She hadn't raised her voice. But somehow she had changed the gravitational pull of the entire room. She let the question linger, not just in the air, but in people's minds. And then, with the same calm that had unnerved everyone 30 seconds earlier, she said, "You're not responsible for what they yell, but you are responsible for what you laugh at while they do." That line didn't hit like a punch. It spread, slow and inevitable, like smoke through cracks in a door. People didn't gasp. They just inhaled more slowly. Bill shifted in his chair, the first visible sign that he might be trying to recalibrate. "Look, I didn't cheer. I wasn't up there chanting anything. I was observing. That's what I do. I go where the fire is, then I come back and tell the story." It sounded rehearsed. Maybe it was, and it might have worked if Jasmine hadn't already seen through it. She tilted her head slightly, not in mockery, but in recognition of a pattern she'd heard before. "That's the thing, though," she said. "When you sit near the fire just to watch, someone else always gets burned. And when you walk away with your hands warm and your audience claps, they forget who was left behind in the smoke." Her voice hadn't risen. Her posture hadn't changed. But somehow everything felt louder. Even the panelist who'd been furiously checking her phone earlier was now sitting up, finally listening. A few heads in the audience had begun nodding, slowly, cautiously, as if they weren't sure they were allowed to agree, but couldn't not. It wasn't Jasmine's tone that pulled them in. It was her certainty, and the truth beneath it. She continued gently but firmly, "There's this idea that comedians get a pass because they're just observers. But if your presence makes a hostile space look safer, even temporarily, then you're not just observing. You're legitimizing. You call it comedy. They call it validation. And the next time someone shouts something cruel, it comes with less shame because you laughed last time. That landed. Bill didn't smile this time. He sat straighter, blinking a little faster. Maybe he was calculating how much of this was going viral already. Maybe he was wondering how much longer she'd keep going. But Jasmine wasn't watching him. She wasn't talking to him anymore. She was talking to everyone who ever stood in a room where hatred pretended to be humor and said nothing. And still, she didn't flinch. Because Jasmine Crockett knew the truth about fire. It doesn't always burn when you're close. Sometimes it warms you first, makes you feel brave, like you can handle it, until the next time it touches someone else, and you realize you helped it grow. Jasmine didn't look at Bill when she began the story. She looked out, past the cameras, past the audience, past the polished wood and cue cards, towards something that wasn't physically there, but emotionally present. Her tone softened, not from fear, but from respect. "There's this kid I met in Fort Worth," she said, her fingers now resting still on the folder in her lap. 17, smart, real sharp, top of his class, wants to study environmental law. Said he used to speak up in every class until he didn't. The audience quieted again, more out of instinct than command. There was something in the way she said, "until he didn't," that felt heavier than a full sentence. Jasmine let the pause stretch just long enough for people to feel it before continuing. One day he challenged something his history teacher said about immigration. Nothing big, just a question. The next day there was a note in his locker. It said, "Go back." That's it. Just those two words. Bill shifted slightly, as if to prepare a comment, but Jasmine didn't break rhythm. The teacher didn't say anything racist out loud. He didn't have to. He just created the kind of space where that kind of note could exist, where a student felt safe enough to write it, fold it, and slip it into someone's locker with no fear of consequence. And when I asked Malik, she said the name softly, finally giving the boy an identity. Why he didn't report it, he just shrugged and said, "They'd probably say I misunderstood." A quiet, low hum moved through the studio. It wasn't noise, it was breath. Audible, held too long, suddenly let go. A woman in the front row blinked more slowly. The panelist who had been rehearsing her next point lowered her hand. And Bill? Bill looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't know how to shape it. Jasmine wasn't telling the story for effect. She was telling it because it explained everything. The rally, the laughter, the silence, all of it. "You see," she went on, "that note didn't just hurt Malik. It taught him. Taught him that speaking up came with a cost. Taught him that some rooms are already made for someone else's comfort. And after that, he stopped raising his hand, stopped volunteering. He learned to shrink." Her voice never broke, but her words carried all the weight they needed. "Now you may think that's just high school," she said, turning ever so slightly toward Bill. Not confrontational, but clear. "But those kids grow up. They learn which voices get laughed at and which ones get applause. They watch who gets a mic, and what happens when someone like me walks into a room that wasn't built for truth." The moment held, not because she was crying, she wasn't. Not because the crowd gasped, they didn't. It held because everyone recognized what she was saying, maybe not intellectually, but emotionally. Deep down, even the people who didn't want to admit it. Jasmine sat back slightly, letting the words settle. That's what platforming means. It's not just what you say, it's what your presence gives permission for other people to do. You walked into that rally and laughed. Malik walked into his classroom and got told to leave, with a note. There was no applause, no dramatic pause, just stillness. And in that stillness, the entire studio finally understood. Jasmine Crockett wasn't debating. She was documenting, and the receipts were people. Bill exhaled through his nose, slower than usual. He wasn't smirking now, not because he agreed, at least not entirely, but because something in him recognized that this wasn't the kind of moment he could pivot away from with a well-timed joke. Jasmine had done something rare in rooms like this. She had broken the contract, the unspoken deal where pain is referenced just long enough to earn applause, then wrapped back up in laughter to keep everyone comfortable. But she hadn't wrapped it. She'd left it open, exposed, staring back at them. He cleared his throat, tried again. I get it. I do, he said, voice low, measured. There are real issues, real things people go through. But come on, if we start treating every word, every laugh like a five-alarm fire, we're never going to survive as a culture. People say stupid stuff. Sometimes they don't mean it. You can't take everything personally. It was a statement dressed like a defense. But underneath, it was still the same dodge. And Jasmine knew it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just tilted her head and said, "You want teenagers to tune out when they're told to leave the country?" No sarcasm, just steel. Bill opened his mouth, then closed it. The panelist on his right glanced at him, then away. Even the strategist, who hadn't spoken in 10 minutes, shifted awkwardly in his seat. The silence wasn't just surrounding Bill now. It was inside him. Jasmine leaned in slightly, not confrontational, but focused. "What if it was your nephew?" she asked. "Your goddaughter? What if someone said that to them? And you knew it was happening, not because they did anything wrong, but because someone else in power made it feel okay to treat them that way?" She didn't need to name the someone. Everyone in the room already had a list. Bill tried again, this time quieter. "I tell jokes," he said. "I try to expose hypocrisy, on both sides. That's my job." "And sometimes," Jasmine said gently, "you do. But you don't get to escape the impact just because you call it comedy. That's not how this works. We all make choices about where we show up, who we stand beside, and what we say afterward. Those choices matter." The line didn't thunder. It didn't echo like a courtroom speech. It landed softly, but it stuck. Because deep down, most people in that studio, maybe even Bill himself, knew she was right. Jasmine sat back, her voice still steady. "You know what the most dangerous part of all this is? It's not even the hate. It's the people who don't see it as hate, the ones who shrug it off, who go to rallies, hear what's said, and walk away thinking it was just loud music and funny signs." She turned toward Bill again, not with judgment, but truth. "You're smart. You know better. That's why this matters." Bill didn't interrupt this time. He didn't laugh or pivot. He just looked at her. And for the first time all night, it looked like he actually heard her. Not just as a guest on his show, but as someone who had brought the weight of truth into a space designed to make light of everything. And for once, no one in the audience was reaching for their phone. They were all too busy holding their breath. Jasmine didn't let the silence go to waste. She looked across the panel, not just at Bill, but at the other guests, the moderator, the production team behind the glass. Her voice didn't sharpen. If anything, it got softer, which made it more dangerous. "There's this myth that who you stand beside doesn't matter, as long as you didn't say the wrong thing, as long as you didn't clap at the worst part, as long as you didn't shout the slur or make the joke. But it matters, it all matters." The author from Vermont glanced down at her notes, suddenly more interested in the print than the conversation. The strategist beside her adjusted his tie, avoiding eye contact. But Jasmine didn't need their confirmation. She had the audience now, the ones in the room and the ones watching from home. You can't show up in a room filled with cruelty, smile through it, then say, "Well, I was just curious." Curiosity isn't neutral. It's a choice. And who you stand beside, who you give your presence to, validates more than your words ever will. She paused, and this time, Bill didn't try to interrupt. Maybe because deep down he was starting to see himself in her words, and he didn't like what was reflected back. Jasmine leaned forward just slightly, the way someone might when they're about to say something that shifts an entire conversation. "Do you know what people saw when they watched you at that rally?" she asked. "They didn't see a comedian on a field trip. They saw permission. They saw a smart, famous man who's supposed to be skeptical, maybe even liberal, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who chanted about stolen elections, who yelled at journalists to go home, who called others less American. And you laughed. So they did too." Her tone remained measured, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. "You say you didn't shout, but you didn't walk away either. You didn't name what needed naming. You normalized the noise." The audience was completely still now. No shifting, no whispering. Even the glow of phones had dimmed, screens lowered out of instinct. What Jasmine was saying wasn't designed for applause. It was designed for accountability. "And I'm not saying you endorsed hate," she continued. "I'm saying you gave it company. And when hate feels like it has company, it gets louder, it gets bolder, and it gets more dangerous." It wasn't an accusation. It was anatomy. A dissection of how moments metastasize into movements. When no one in the room chooses to say, "Enough." Jasmine finally allowed herself a breath, then added, "I represent people who get followed in grocery stores, people who get notes in their lockers, people who get pulled over for tinted windows that aren't illegal, and they don't have shows like this to explain themselves. They don't get to say, 'I was just watching.' They live with the consequences of what gets laughed at by people who never meant harm, but never stopped it either." Her eyes found Bill again, not angry, not accusatory, but unshakably honest. "So no, this isn't about whether you shouted. It's about whether you stood there while someone else did and let your silence be mistaken for agreement." That was the line that cracked something in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Because in a world obsessed with what you say, Jasmine Crockett was asking a much harder question. Where did you stand while someone else said it? The lights above the stage seemed to dim, not because the studio had changed them, but because the energy in the room had. Jasmine wasn't loud. She didn't have to be. Her words had taken hold of the space, like smoke curling through invisible cracks in the air. And in that stillness, what lingered wasn't guilt, it was clarity. Bill looked down at his note cards, then back at her. He opened his mouth as if searching for something, humor maybe, or logic, or even distance, but nothing came out. He wasn't used to being here, in a room where the rules of engagement had shifted and the crowd wasn't laughing on cue. He looked not like a man defeated, but like one recalibrating, asking himself silently what else he hadn't been hearing. Jasmine, for her part, didn't let up, but she didn't attack either. She simply kept unfolding truth after truth, like pages from a book everyone claimed they had read, but never really opened. "You know," she said quietly, "people love to talk about neutrality. They wear it like a badge. Like if they just don't pick a side, they're somehow more evolved, more reasonable." She paused, eyes now locked on Bill's. "But silence isn't neutral, not when there's a fire in the room. Not when someone's screaming from the back and you're sipping coffee in the front row pretending you don't hear it." No one moved, not on stage, not in the audience. The panelists sat perfectly still. The crew behind the glass stayed frozen. Even the lights above seemed steadier than before, as if the entire set had realized that this wasn't just another segment, it was a shift. Jasmine continued, "Neutrality is the comfort of people who are rarely targeted, who've never had to wonder if their silence might cost someone else their job, their vote, their breath. And the people who have that luxury, they're the ones who get to call our pain an overreaction, a moment, a misunderstanding." Her voice softened even more. Not weaker, more intimate. But we don't get that luxury. We don't get to pretend it was nothing when someone follows us through a store, or slips a note in our locker, or tells us to go back. Because for us, that moment stays. It stains. And it teaches us who's safe and who's silently watching. Bill didn't smile. He didn't joke. He just looked at her. And in that look was something more honest than anything he'd said all night. Uncertainty. Not the kind that came from being confused, but the kind that came from finally realizing what you missed by thinking you didn't need to choose. Jasmine leaned back slightly, as if releasing the weight she'd been carrying since the segment began. "So when people ask me why I care about where you stood, or what you laughed at, or what you didn't say, I tell them this. Because silence isn't a void. It's a message. It tells people watching that the line hasn't been crossed yet. That what just happened, still acceptable." She looked out toward the audience again, then beyond them, into the invisible thread that connected this room to every person watching from a couch or a bus stop or a break room somewhere in America. And that's how injustice survives. Not through action, through indifference, through the silence we keep calling neutral. And just like that, the monologue was done. But no one applauded, because it wasn't the kind of truth you clap for. It was the kind you carry. Jasmine didn't wait for the moment to settle. She stepped straight into the next truth, not with volume, but with precision. "You know what happened after that rally, Bill?" she asked, eyes steady, voice calm. "You went home. You recorded your podcast. You joked about the crowd, the hats, the chaos, and people listened. Some laughed, some rolled their eyes, but others pointed to you and said, 'See, even Bill Maher gets it. Even he doesn't think it's that bad.'" Bill's brow furrowed slightly, the crease of someone who knows he's heard this before, but never this clearly. "That's the danger," Jasmine continued. "You didn't endorse what they said. You didn't echo their chants. But your presence became their defense. Your bravery, what the headlines called your bold attempt to bridge the divide, wasn't read as courage. It was read as confirmation." The audience sat in silence, not frozen, but reflective. This wasn't cancel culture. This wasn't outrage. This was surgery. "Because here's what people do with that kind of moment," she went on. "They clip it, share it, stitch your face next to theirs and say, 'We're not extreme. Look who came. Look who laughed.' They take your neutrality, your brand of detached commentary, and they turn it into an alibi." Bill leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, not defensively, but contemplatively. For the first time, he looked like a man realizing he'd been used in a narrative he thought he was controlling. Jasmine let him sit with that thought for a moment before adding, "You became someone's excuse, not because you meant to, but because you didn't mean not to." That line shifted the room again. The author on the panel stopped fidgeting. The strategist looked down at his hands, and somewhere off camera, a producer whispered something into a headset, but no one moved to cut the segment. Jasmine kept going. "This happens more often than you think. People in power, people with platforms, drop into hostile spaces and walk out untouched. Meanwhile, the people who actually live there, the ones who can't leave the fire after filming, keep getting burned. And every time someone like you visits, calls it a social experiment, then walks away saying it wasn't that deep, the flames spread." Bill's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't speak. "I'm not here to say you're the villain," Jasmine said. "I'm here to say that sometimes the people who consider themselves the most objective, the most evolved, do the most harm. Not because they act with malice, but because they act without responsibility." She leaned in, elbows on her knees now. "Not aggressive, just real. You said you were observing, that it was your job to be there, that you didn't cheer, didn't chant, didn't harm. But when harm was happening around you, and you stayed, what did that tell the people watching?" The question didn't need an answer. Not yet, because everyone in the room was already asking it of themselves. Jasmine leaned back again, hands folded. "Your bravery wasn't neutral, Bill. It was useful, and not to the people you think." And with that, another layer peeled back, not just in Bill, but in everyone who had ever thought being in the room was enough. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just naming complicity. She was exposing how easily it dresses itself in the clothes of courage. Jasmine let her last sentence hang for just a moment longer than comfort allowed, then sat back slightly, not retreating, but grounding herself. The silence she left behind wasn't empty. It was instructive. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight, not confrontational, not defensive, but like someone who had been waiting years to be asked the right question. "You know what I hear the most when I speak up?" she said, eyes now scanning the audience, not just the host. "That I'm too sensitive, that I'm reading too much into things, that it's not that deep." She didn't roll her eyes, she didn't sneer. She just nodded slowly. "Funny how the people saying that never live on the edge of what they're laughing at." Bill didn't reply, maybe because he knew she wasn't just talking to him anymore. "There's this unspoken rule in American culture," Jasmine continued, "where if you're not the one holding the mic, you better be grateful just to be in the room. You better smile, be palatable, don't be too much. But that gratitude is just another way of asking us to be silent, to be small, to not interrupt the narrative someone else built for their comfort." The audience didn't shift much, but something had changed. They were no longer waiting for the laugh. They were listening for the truth. My entire life, she said, I've watched people from the margins be told to wait their turn, that the moment wasn't right, that the country wasn't ready, and meanwhile the harm didn't wait. The policies didn't wait. The whispers didn't wait. So why should we? The strategist next to her uncrossed his arms, visibly uncomfortable. The author looked over as if to say something, but thought better of it. Because everyone knew, if they spoke now, it better be worth the interruption. I was taught that if you want to be taken seriously, you lower your voice. If you want to be heard, you don't make people uncomfortable. But I've learned that the only way some people listen is when they're finally uncomfortable. Bill nodded slowly. He wasn't nodding in agreement. He was nodding in recognition, the kind that happens when a mirror has been held up too long to ignore. There's a reason we're having this conversation on your stage, Jasmine said. There's a reason I had to wait to be asked here. Because even in 2025, the microphone still lives in the hands of the same people. And the rest of us? We're expected to be grateful just for the invitation. She didn't raise her voice, but her words landed like a drumbeat. So when we finally get a mic, we use it. We don't soften. We don't apologize. We speak for the ones who never got one, for the kids in classrooms, for the mothers in grocery stores, for the fathers pulled over on the side of the highway who never got to explain themselves. Then she turned, not dramatically, just intentionally, back toward Bill. You ask what this is really about? It's about who gets to speak and who gets spoken about. It's about the difference between comedy and consequence, between platform and performance, between saying something clever and saying something that costs you. For the first time all night, no one shifted, no one blinked, no one reached for their water. It was the stillness of accountability settling in. And Jasmine, calm and composed, sat with that stillness like someone who had finally earned her seat, not by invitation, but by insistence. Jasmine let the silence settle once more, before lifting her gaze toward Bill. The lights glinted faintly off her earrings, but her expression remained still, unblinking, unshaken. The truth is, she said, her voice steady but intimate, most people don't flinch when injustice feels far away. They flinch when it gets close. Bill didn't move, but something in his posture subtly shifted, as if the words had touched something deeper than debate. Jasmine noticed. She didn't press it. She just kept going. When it's happening in a town you've never heard of, you tweet, you sigh, you shake your head. But when it shows up in your city, your school board, your family gathering, suddenly people don't want to talk about it anymore. Suddenly it's too political. Suddenly it's divisive. She wasn't accusing, she was describing. And in doing so, she turned what could have been a confrontation into a reflection. A mirror held not just to Bill, but to the entire audience, to the culture. There's a moment I always think about, Jasmine said, folding her hands in her lap again. It was 2 years ago. A man stood at a city council meeting in Houston, just an ordinary resident, and said he was tired of hearing about systemic racism, said it was all exaggerated. And then, without missing a beat, he called the black councilwoman beside him articulate for her kind. In public, on camera, with no shame. She let that image sink in, then added, when I called it out, I got emails from people telling me I was too aggressive, too dramatic, that I should have just moved on, because the moment I made it personal, it made them uncomfortable. The crowd still wasn't making a sound, and that was exactly how Jasmine wanted it. Not because she craved the silence, but because the silence meant they were actually listening. I've learned something in these rooms, she said. People are fine talking about racism until it means looking at someone they admire. People are fine discussing injustice until it means questioning a system they benefit from. They're okay with truth until it's their joke, their uncle, their network, their rally. Her eyes locked with Bill's again. And when it gets too close, that's when people flinch. Bill didn't flinch. Not physically, but something in his eyes pulled back, like a window had just cracked open too fast in a cold room. Jasmine didn't let the moment stretch into cruelty. She offered it for what it was, a challenge. You said you showed up to that rally because you wanted to understand the madness, the tribalism, the performance, she said. But here's the thing, Bill. Understanding isn't passive. If you're going to walk into the fire, you better say it's hot. You don't get to warm your hands, walk away, and say, well, at least I was there. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't waver. It simply resonated. You don't get to claim bravery if you only stay until the truth makes you flinch. That was the last line. She didn't follow it with a rebuttal or a look of triumph. She just let it hang, let it breathe. And for the first time that night, even Bill Maher, known for his clever pivots, his tactical jabs, his polished unpredictability, had nothing left to hide behind. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won an argument. She had removed the stage beneath it. Up in the control booth, the glass separating the producers from the stage had never felt thinner. It wasn't because of sound, it was because of tension, the kind that seeps through wires and circuits and lenses, the kind that makes a seasoned broadcast team stop fiddling with sliders and start holding their breath. Normally, the booth hummed with silent choreography, camera feeds, lighting cues, segment clocks. Quiet chatter about which shot to cut to, which line to amplify, which joke needed a reaction shot. But tonight, no one was reaching for the reaction cam. No one was switching to the crowd, because the crowd wasn't laughing, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't playing the game. One of the assistant producers, a woman in her 30s with a headset and years of live television behind her, leaned toward the lead director and mouthed something off mic. "Do we cut to break?" The director didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the monitor, on Jasmine's face. Calm, clear, unbothered. Not just composed, but composed in a way that said she hadn't come to play the part of reasonable opposition. She had come to say something no one in the studio could pretend not to hear. Bill Maher still sat across from her, but the air around him had changed. The subtle charisma he always wielded so easily, the arched eyebrows, the ironic pauses, the knowing glances at the camera. None of it was working tonight. It wasn't that Jasmine had overpowered him. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even leaned in much. But what she had done was more dangerous. She had shifted the frame. This wasn't a panel discussion anymore. It was a reckoning. From the booth, the floor director's voice crackled over the internal comms. "Should we re-cue the next topic?" Another voice replied, "What topic? You want to interrupt that for a segment on late-night voter turnout?" Back on stage, Jasmine sat with the kind of stillness that redefined control. Her hands weren't gesturing. Her eyes weren't darting. She wasn't filling space. She was using it. And as she spoke, you could feel the floor beneath the format start to slip. Bill glanced up toward the booth. Not obviously, just enough for the trained eye to catch. It was the look of a host searching for backup. A moment of unspoken, "What do I do?" sent upward through the studio lights. But no cue came back. No camera redirect. No producer whispering in his earpiece to change the tone. Because for once, there was no tone left to manage. Jasmine didn't seem to notice the signal, or maybe she did, and chose not to acknowledge it. Her voice remained even, her rhythm unshaken. "You don't get to play with fire," she said, then complained that someone else got burned. "You don't get to walk into a rally full of hostility and walk out with jokes. Because the people living with that hostility, they don't get punchlines. They get policies." In the booth, a pause. Then finally the lead producer spoke, barely above a whisper, but everyone heard it. "Let it roll." Because they all knew what was happening now wasn't just good television. It was a moment that no camera cut could interrupt and no edit could soften. And Jasmine Crockett had just taken control, not of the segment, not of the room, but of the narrative itself. The weight of silence pressed against the studio walls like humidity before a storm. Jasmine had been still for a few seconds, but in those seconds, something had shifted again. Not in the pacing of the show, not in the tone of the discussion, but in the psychological terrain of everyone in the room. They weren't waiting for a joke. They weren't waiting for a punchline or even a pause. They were waiting for something they didn't know how to name, but could feel was coming. And then Jasmine said it. "You know," she began quietly, not looking at anyone in particular, "the loudest thing you said this week was nothing." The sentence didn't shake the room. It froze it. Bill didn't move. His posture stayed the same, but his eyes blinked once, slower than before. A slow, human reaction to something that hit deeper than logic. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even dramatic. That was what made it so dangerous. It was a mirror, held without judgment, just long enough that he had to look. Jasmine didn't elaborate, not right away. She let the words hang in the air, suspended like a slow-falling feather no one dared brush aside. Then gently she continued. You stood in a crowd where people screamed about stolen elections, where they shouted about real Americans. You heard things that weren't politically incorrect. They were just cruel. And you didn't push back. You called it a comedy safari. She turned slightly to face him, not confrontational, but undeniably direct. You used your show, your platform, to say it wasn't that bad. And people who say those same things every day, looked at your face and said, see, he doesn't think we're dangerous. Even Bill Maher came. The phrase, even Bill Maher, echoed in the air. It wasn't a punch. It was an exposure. You became someone's excuse, she said, and the quiet returned like an old friend. No one in the panel moved. The author beside her folded her arms tighter. The strategist shifted his weight as if preparing to speak, but he didn't. Because what could you say in a room where the truth had already been said so simply, so clearly, that dressing it in policy or politics would only cheapen it? Even the cameras seemed to lean closer now, their slow zooms quieter than usual. The boom mic didn't swing. The lighting techs held still. There was no producer yelling in anyone's ear, because this wasn't a moment to manage, it was a moment to witness. A woman in the third row, a retired teacher, hands folded in her lap, nodded slowly once. Not because she agreed with the politics, not because she'd chosen a side, but because she recognized something in Jasmine's voice that transcended ideology. It was the sound of someone speaking with nothing to gain and everything to risk. Jasmine sat back slightly, not victorious but firm. I'm not here to cancel you, she said. I'm here to remind you that silence has weight, and you don't have to march with extremists to be useful to them. Sometimes, all it takes is pretending they're harmless. That sentence, pretending they're harmless, landed harder than anything before it, because that's what people do. They laugh, they nod, they change the subject, they call it a joke, and the moment passes. But tonight, it didn't pass. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just break the rhythm of a comedy show, she rewrote the rules of what it meant to be brave on live television. Jasmine didn't lean forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her pitch. The power in her words didn't come from volume. It came from the fact that she was no longer trying to be heard. She was simply speaking, as if everything she said was already true, and it was the rest of the room that had to catch up. And somehow that was more commanding than any shouted takedown or fiery rebuttal could ever be. The room was still, not stunned, not breathless, just stilled, like a pendulum that had stopped mid-swing. The cameras kept rolling. The panelists barely moved. Even Bill Maher, who was rarely at a loss, didn't speak. Not because he had surrendered, but because he understood, instinctively, that the moment needed nothing else. Jasmine folded her hands again. You've built a career on calling out hypocrisy, she said evenly, on saying the things others were too afraid to say, and sometimes you've been right to do it. But the test of integrity isn't what you say when it's easy. It's what you say when it's close, when it costs you, when it forces you to look at the people who laugh at your jokes and ask, why do they feel so safe around you? Her words didn't accuse. They illuminated. You've said the quiet parts out loud, she continued. But when the room needed volume, you whispered. Or worse, you stayed quiet. And that silence wasn't neutral. It was a signal. To every person watching who already believed their cruelty was just common sense. It told them they were fine, that they weren't crossing a line, because you didn't say they were. No one interrupted. Even the usual coughs from the audience, those subtle human breaks in flow, were absent. It was as if everyone had collectively agreed to stay still, to not blink, for fear they might miss something that only happens once. And then Jasmine did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a smug smile. Not a smile of victory, but the kind of smile that comes from finishing something you didn't want to do, but had to. A soft exhale in the shape of resilience. I don't need applause, she said, almost to herself. I don't need a trending clip. I just need people to sit with what was said and stop pretending this is about sides. She looked up again, this time at the audience. Not to perform, not to connect, just to check. Were you with me? Did you stay? Did you hear me? Not just my voice, but my point? And they had. There was no eruption of applause, no choreographed cheer, just quiet understanding. And somehow that meant more. Bill cleared his throat finally as if trying to reclaim his space. You've got guts, he said softly. I'll give you that. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her message had already filled the space, rewired the air, adjusted the focus of everyone watching. Because sometimes a mic drop doesn't come with noise. It comes when someone refuses to raise their voice, because they know the truth is already loud enough. The moment didn't end when the camera stopped. It started. 37 minutes after the show wrapped, a clip surfaced online. Not from the official feed, but from a woman in the seventh row, holding her phone just below eye level. The angle was slightly tilted, the lighting overexposed. The sound wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be, because the words were clear. Jasmine Crockett, seated with composed defiance, calmly saying, "You don't have to march with extremists to be useful to them. Sometimes all it takes is pretending they're harmless." The video spread like a pulse. One upload became 20, then hundreds. On TikTok, it was remixed over soft piano. On X, it was clipped with hashtags like #QuietTruth and #Jasmine did not blink. On Instagram, it was posted by accounts that usually shared cooking tips and parenting advice, now captioning, "This, just this." It wasn't the shout of a movement. It was the hum beneath one. By the next morning, the phrase, "The loudest thing you said this week was nothing," was trending on multiple platforms. News outlets tried to summarize it. Congresswoman confronts Maher over rally. But none of them quite captured it, because this wasn't a confrontation. It was a calibration. In Dallas, a local reporter aired a segment titled, "When Silence Isn't Safety." In Detroit, a youth pastor played the clip during a Friday night discussion circle with teens. And in a Missouri public high school, a social studies teacher paused his lesson and asked his students, "Why do you think she didn't raise her voice?" One student said, "Because then they'd call her angry." Another added, "Because this way, they had to listen." The impact wasn't loud. It was layered. Not just likes and views, but recognition. Quiet, personal, unsettling. It reached people in places it wasn't supposed to go. A retired police captain in Arizona reposted the video saying, "Didn't agree with her before, but I heard her tonight." A suburban mom in Virginia wrote, "She didn't talk down. She didn't shout. She just told the truth. And somehow that hurt more." Meanwhile, Jasmine didn't tweet, didn't post a recap, no victory lap. She went back to her office, returned to constituent calls, wrote follow-up notes on housing reform, because this wasn't about a moment, it was about a message. And the message was doing just fine on its own. The clip wasn't polished, it wasn't filtered, but it was real. And for a country so used to performance, something about a woman who didn't flinch, who didn't fold, resonated in ways even she hadn't planned. In a time where noise ruled the algorithm, Jasmine Crockett had done the impossible. She'd gone viral by refusing to raise her voice. Monday came quietly. No press release, no statement. Just Bill Maher in his podcast studio, sipping black coffee from a mug that read, "I'm not wrong, just early." But today, even the mug looked unsure. He adjusted the mic, glanced at his producer through the glass, then leaned in. The intro music faded, a beat longer than usual before his voice cut through. "So," he began, his tone lower than his usual snark, "I'm guessing most of you saw Friday night's episode, or at least what happened after minute 42. No laugh track, no wink, just air." He paused, exhaled, then said it plainly. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett gave me a lot to think about. That's the truth. And I won't sit here and spin it. I heard her. And I get why it landed the way it did." That sentence alone would have shocked some of his longtime fans. The man who'd made a career out of biting back wasn't defending himself. He was, at least momentarily, stepping aside. I don't agree with everything she said, he continued. I still believe in talking to people across the aisle. I still believe that comedy is supposed to be messy and uncomfortable and provocative. But I also believe in listening, especially when the person speaking isn't shouting. He scratched the back of his neck, looked off camera, then added, there was something about the way she held that space. Not loud, not flashy, just full of weight. I've had senators on this show who couldn't hold a moment like that, and she did it without flinching. The chat window beside the live stream was moving fast. Some applauding, others questioning, a few demanding he go back to being funny. But Bill didn't engage. He stayed in the pocket of discomfort and for once didn't try to laugh his way out of it. She made one point, he said slowly, that I haven't been able to shake. That silence isn't neutral. That just being in a space, standing next to the wrong crowd, even if you say nothing, can still mean something to the people watching. That stuck with me. He leaned back, not for show, but because the weight of the admission was real. And maybe that's the point, he said finally. Maybe the point of that entire moment wasn't to win a debate. Maybe it was just to remind people like me that showing up is only the beginning. What you do while you're there, that's what history remembers. He reached for the mug again, held it for a second, then didn't drink. And just before fading to outro, he added one more thing. Soft, uncharacteristically sincere. She didn't try to own me. She tried to make me listen. I hope I did. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a reversal, but it was something rare, a shift. And for an audience that had grown used to punchlines, the absence of one was the clearest sign that something had landed. The clip had already passed 1 million views when Jasmine Crockett opened her phone the next morning. Mentions, tags, message requests. Her inbox looked like a wildfire had swept through it. Staffers were buzzing. Journalists were calling. Commentators were already dissecting the exchange frame by frame, asking, was this the turning point? The moment someone finally cracked the late-night wall? But Jasmine didn't respond. Not to the trending hashtags, not to the think pieces, not even to the emails from strangers calling her a voice of the people. Because she hadn't walked into that studio to win. She had walked in to be heard and to speak for those who never got the mic. She reposted the clip only once. No caption, no comment, just the video. And then she went back to work. A few days later, when a journalist reached her for a quick interview outside a budget hearing, they asked if she considered the moment a political win. Jasmine just smiled. Not for the camera, just gently, almost to herself. I'm not here for trophies, she said. I'm here to make sure the people who get silenced every day still have someone speaking when the mic finally turns on. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a mission. While the internet was still spinning with edits and recaps, Jasmine was in a school library in Oak Cliff, reading policy briefs with a principal about digital equity funding. No cameras, no spotlights, just the work. Because the truth she delivered on that stage wasn't meant to be a victory lap. It was a mirror. And once the world sees itself in one, it's not applause that matters, it's what happens next. The following Friday, the show resumed. New guests, new jokes, new headlines. The intro music played like always. The applause was loud, the timing sharp, the transitions flawless. But something, even if no one could quite name it, felt different. Not broken, just adjusted. Bill Maher leaned back in his chair like he always did. But when he glanced toward the far right seat of the panel, the seat Jasmine had occupied, his eyes didn't just scan. They paused. That week's guests were prepared. Witty, insightful, but more careful. No one interrupted as fast. No one cracked jokes over someone else's story. And when the conversation brushed up against something uncomfortable, race, class, identity, it didn't pivot quite so quickly. There was no mention of Jasmine. Not on the air, not in a monologue, not in a nod to last week. But her presence lingered like a scent in the room, subtle but unmistakable. Not because she'd said something outrageous, but because she'd said something undeniable. And when someone speaks undeniable truth in a space built to bounce ideas like tennis balls, it changes the acoustics forever. In the control booth, the lead producer, who once championed pace above pause, let a panelist hold silence a little longer. In the editing room, a junior staffer left in a shot that was less flattering, but more honest. On social media, a few longtime fans admitted they'd watched Jasmine's segment twice, and were still thinking about it days later. And in the audience, people didn't laugh as easily. They listened more deliberately. That's the thing about rooms like that. You can clean the set, re-cue the lights, book the next episode, but if something real happened there, something unscripted and unflinching, the room will remember, even if no one says her name. Weeks passed. The clip still made its rounds. Quietly now, passed from inbox to inbox, DM to DM, captioned not with hashtags but with words like, "This stayed with me," or "Watch this when you're ready to feel something." Jasmine never spoke about it again. She didn't build a campaign around it. She didn't reference it in interviews. She didn't need to. The work continued. Housing, education, voting rights. Microphones came and went. But that one night, that one seat, that one voice remained. And somewhere in a university lecture, a professor paused a political communication class and played the clip. Not the whole thing, just one moment. The moment where Jasmine Crockett looked a national figure in the eye and said, "The loudest thing you said this week was nothing." The room was silent again. Because some lines aren't just powerful, they're permanent. Final lines aren't always shouted. They don't always come with dramatic lighting or cue cards. Sometimes they arrive quietly, dressed in calm, delivered without a tremble. But they stay. They echo through rooms long after the chairs are empty. They show up in grocery store conversations, in classroom questions, in private moments where someone finally finds the courage to say, "That's not okay." And the final lesson? It's this. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You just need to speak a truth so clear, no one can pretend they didn't hear it. Some truths don't need to echo to be heard. They just need to be said, without flinching. Jasmine Crockett reminded us that it's not always the volume that defines courage, but the clarity. In your life, when the room gets quiet and the moment arrives, ask yourself this. Not what will you say, but what truth will you stand beside?